There we go.
Great. Shall I set a bit of context before we dive in? I know we talked about it, Yurik, but I guess Myra, just for you. So there will be a incident assessment, and RCAs come out of the specific incident. But from a kind of process point of view and how we handle these things, like it seems like something we don't really have it written down anywhere, I don't think. So that's really kind of the goal, is what process do we need to handle these sorts of things? Cool.
Right. Let's see. So there's the timeline. I think that sort of speaks for itself. The issue in itself contains also quite a bit of info. I think sort of the larger overarching problem here is that regardless of sort of what state our migrations truly are in, because I think there's a lot of different opinions on that, but maybe not so many facts. The truth is that we don't really feel comfortable rolling back. When I say rolling back, I don't necessarily mean just like reverting all nodes to run the previous version. It can just be rolling back a single migration, for example.
Yeah, and I think I don't think we will easily fix that. Like, I think that's for the sake of this conversation, let's just have that as a fact that we can't roll back, right?
Right. No. So that is, that's what I mean. That's sort of the larger overarching story.
Yeah.
But it plays a role here in a sense that that influenced the steps that we took as a result. Because normally we would have said, oh, hey, this migration times out, let's revert or something like that.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But in this case, we're kind of sort of between a rock and a hard place where we can't really revert, but at that point, we might also not be able to move forward.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and that's the bit I want to kind of, so what I think was really interesting for me was the fact the time it happened, just because it was right around the handover time. So I guess I'll start maybe backwards, which is probably the, when you come online, Yurik, assuming this has all happened and we've done the exact same handover as Myra did, and various engineers have kind of been involved to various degrees. What I'm kind of interested in is when you come online, what would be your steps for that point onwards?
So the first step there is to basically just go through the sort of system state. So, read the handover message in Slack. And also just check, hey, are there any current auto deploy blockers? What version are we running? In case there was an incident overnight, or take some time to read through the issue, try to sort of figure out, okay, what happened? Where are we right now? And perhaps more importantly, how does that affect the deployment steps for the next couple of hours? The sort of exact outcome there varies a bit. Like sometimes it's very, if it's resolved, it's like, oh, it's resolved, great. But there's times where it's maybe still sort of at play. Maybe the actual issue is resolved, but maybe we now have to wait for a bunch of fixes, for example.
So in this particular situation, like assuming that had been the case, like let's just kind of like cut from a process discussion point of view, let's cut out the whole incident and Myron. So coming online and this being the handover message, like what would have been the next steps?
So in this case, if I come online and somebody says, hey, I did the deploy, but I have to leave because whatever reason, and there's this migration timing out. First step there would be trying to figure out, okay, is there an incident? What is the existing info beyond the messaging? And then second, it would come down to trying to figure out, okay, why is this failing? Is this just something we can retry? Because sometimes migrations time out for whatever reason. You retry them and they work. Other times they time out consistently. So the step there would basically be debugging, basically, okay, what is going on? And that might involve just asking other people to do it. it kind of varies there. So with my database background, for example, take a look at these migrations myself, and maybe try to figure, okay, what's the source code of this migration? What does it do? But it kind of depends on if other people are already doing that. So if I come online and I see people already looking into it,
Yeah, that's good. That's actually good.
I would sort of step more into a sort of a coordinating role. We say, okay, hey, you're looking into this. Hey, can I help? That sort of thing.
How much of that investigation had you already done, Myra?
Yes, just to provide some context, I was aware of this previous incident that happened, I think, prior release to 13.2, and it was exactly the same migration, and well, the same migrations because they were a lot. So my initial thought was, okay, let's solve it the same way we solved it in the last milestone. So I pinged the merge request author and I pinged the database maintainer to take a look. The merge request author was online and he fixed it in the same way, but the database maintainer was not online and there was no other database maintainer available. So it was already, I think, 6 or 7 p.m. for me. So it was like, okay, this is the state we got. I posted a message for Yorick and well, Yorick took it from there. What I was not clear is that, so the post migrations failed, but I wasn't super clear by that moment that I should have declared an incident, like a production incident, because for me it was like, hey, the post migration failed, but I had no idea that that was going to repercute in the other deployments. So perhaps another action from my side would have been to declare an incident, and perhaps more people will have been involved in that moment instead of waiting until IMEA come online.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I know that's exactly the point of this conversation. Is actually, we don't have that written into our process at all. And this was a really interesting one because it really just because of the time it happened, right? Which was we didn't have everyone online and we had this handover. So yeah, I totally agree. I think declaring an incident is probably the right way to go. Not necessarily like a super high significance one, like I think an S3 or something like that. Something just so that what that probably would have hopefully meant is that first thing on Friday, as people came online, it had their sort of eyes straight away. What's interesting about this one is it does block deployments. So it kind of does fall under our bucket of deployments are blocked. We raise an incident. Like we couldn't run another deployment because the post-migration step hadn't completed. And actually that was the hard thing, was working out how to get past this step in order to fix it. So yeah, I think that probably is like, do you feel like, is that something that feels comfortable to do, to like raise an incident like that just as you're going offline?
Yeah, I think I should. Yeah, I think I feel comfortable doing. I mean, it's just like putting a comment in Slack and boom, the issue is opened. And perhaps in retrospective, that would have been a good thing to mention to the SRE on call, because the SRE on call was also clueless about like, oh, what is going on? And then he saw my message and then he linked like, oh, this is failing because of this. But perhaps better action would have been for me to notify like, hey, the post migrations are failing. Some errors might be happening in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think there also the sort of challenging part is there. Due to time zones, creating incidents at the end of your day, whatever hour that is, can be a bit odd. So for example, let's say for a moment, I am the only release manager. And, let's say at 6 o'clock, I clock out, but there's an incident, so I create an issue. There's kind of two things that will happen. One, the SREs and everything, they will sort of jump on, but I might not be around. Or maybe, I handed it over, but there's this thing where people start working, but the person reporting it is not there. So you can extend it, but of course, depends a bit on how long the incident takes place. And I think in case of Myra, there's the issue that when it's the end of her day, I think for me, it's about midnight, I think like 1 o'clock or something. So there's still like a solid 9 hours basically until most people would start. So if she creates an incident, and so let's say 9 o'clock in the evening, that means for a considerable amount of time, there's no release manager that would be able to help out. And so then you're kind of at this point where you either have to stick around for longer, which may have negative effects elsewhere, or you basically have to, I guess, be really good at handing it over by saying, "Oh, here's all the info. Good luck. You're on your own." Which it's not the nicest thing.
I don't know if we're necessarily. I mean, yeah, I guess there is that. You do probably need to put in the info. I mean, in this case, I think that kind of happened anyway, though, right? Like,
right.
I think the downsides of this one was, I think Marin may have raised it an S1. So like a lower priority, like severity would be more appropriate for this one.
Right. Like we can make it clear that, SREs don't have to jump in immediately or whatever it is, depending on the state. Although then you do kind of reach this point where it's like, okay, if we don't expect SREs or anybody to jump in right now, like it's more sort of a reminder, then it's basically not an incident, it's more just like a issue.
But I think it is a kind of pick it up as soon as you have availability, right? And actually less for the SRE, I think more for the engineers or like people who like maintainers or someone like that. Like I think I think it makes sense to give it some priority in that case.
Right.
I mean, in my opinion, at least.
Right. No. So I agree. Like incidents are a good place for it because they are generally treated much more importantly than some issue in some random issue tracker. The thing is, if we sort of make this a process, we do have to make it clear, like, hey, if you create an incident and it doesn't require like on-call people to sort of immediately jump behind a computer, somehow make this clear, whether it's a label or text or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do we already have like, how does the severity rating work?
So we have a page in the handbook where it sort of lists which severity you have to assign. I think it's based on how many people are affected or something like that. And I think like S1 is like basically company extinction event, and then S2 is like this much percentage. It's changed a little over the years, so I don't remember exactly what the latest definition is. But it is also sometimes a little arbitrary. We sometimes look at it as like, to me, this is an S1, but apparently it's an S2. But anyway, it's somewhere in the handbook.
Do we always have an SRE on call? Is there always someone online?
I think so. I think so. There is always somebody on call. Whether they're actually available at all times is, of course, open for debate. Like if they're basically on the toilet, for example. But I believe we do have 24-hour coverage from SREs. Okay.
So maybe that's another thing, right? Is we assign it, like we should pick whatever the right severity is, like for the process and update. But then I think, we can just, in this case, I think it would have been completely fair to, for Mario to put more or less everything you wrote in Slack and just be like, this is more of a, eyes need to be on this first thing tomorrow because here's the situation.
And I think for that S3 will be a fine priority because it still blocks deployments, so it's very visible. It shows up in the ChatOps output, and it's not severe enough that people would basically be like, "Oh God, we need to do something right now." I think looking back with these kind of issues, SREs usually aren't actually a problem. Like they're very responsive. They are there when you need them. I think a bigger issue is when you need a developer. That's usually when it's like, oh, okay, we have the dev on call, but I'm not sure if we have 24-hour coverage.
We don't, but that's kind of the point of having this incident, right? And what I was actually going to say when I asked about whether SREs were on call 24 hours was, like, I think we can raise it best, make it clear that here's the intention we're going for, and let them reprioritize it as they see fit.
No, exactly. But so for devs, like with these migrations, sometimes we might need a dev to look into.
Oh yeah, of course. Like, I totally agree. And I think that's in this case, like we were not going to get this fixed before Friday morning, and that's totally fine. No issue there. It's more was just the it's more the gap, right? It's the how can we more easily make sure that when people sign on Friday morning, they're immediately hands on with this one. So that's more what the goal is, I think. So
right, yeah, for that I think incidents are fine.
Okay, so what in that case? Who would like an action to update our process docs?
Let me see. I can take that one. Let's see. So I'll write that down. Docs. Let's see. So what we add is when there's an incident during handover, we create an S3 incident. I guess S3 incident. Do we do that for all cases or specific?
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Like for post migrations, like an S3 sounds reasonable, but if something failed, like in the production fleet, like deployment to the API or Git, that sounds like a little bit more serious. Like that needs to be solved right away, probably. So that might be an S1 or an S2.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think for this one, it was like you did a great job, Myra, of being able to sort of identify that customers weren't impacted. Like if we hadn't been sure of that, if it failed in any other point, like yeah, it would have been an S1 probably to get that resolved ASAP. So yeah, I think there's some part of this which is like being very clear about what the impact is. If we're not sure, then it's probably an S2 in line with the current documentation. So any deployment failures should be an S2. I think this case might be slightly special because it was we're not intending to be online and deploying right now, but tomorrow we need this unblocked with some urgency. So I think that one is maybe where an S3 is more appropriate.
Right. So in that case, yeah, post-deployment migrations S3, and I guess if the higher priority basically, depending on the impact that you determine. Deploy failure, if you can't resolve it at that point. Yeah, I think S2 is kind of reasonable there because S1 would imply we're currently basically down, which
exactly. Yeah, that's already in the documents. So yeah.
Is S2 if not solvable. Oops. Let's see. I guess we have to make it clear whether SREs or not are needed. Clear. All right, and then yeah, I guess communicate to other RM. That's kind of already there. Oh, I can't write. To RM. There you go. Okay, so I'll update that one. Add that info there, and then just assign it to the two of you for review. Yeah, I think in sort of extension to this, my memory is a little fuzzy on this particular incident. I recall that when this incident popped, it was a bit of a sort of question like, okay, who's going to look at the actual migration? How are you going to determine, is there an actual flaw with this migration that we need a dev to fix, or is there like a retry or something else? I think that's a bit of a recurring issue. Not sure if it's worth discussing here. But so we have SREs for infrastructure work. We have dev on calls sort of general dev problems. But often with these database migrations, the problem is fairly specific, and the sort of knowledge needed for that is in limited supply. And I think we've seen this in the past too, where we have some issue with migration, and we basically sit around like, shit, who are we going to ask? Because normally we would ask this or that person, but that one is on vacation. For that one, it's 2 o'clock in the night. That one is in the hospital, whatever. I'm saying I'm not sure if it's worth discussing because normally the approach then would be to revert, which we don't really trust.
I think raise an incident. So, because I think all of these options are options, right? Like we can go forwards, we can go backwards, we can do nothing, whatever. But what's good about raising an incident is you get a Zoom call. So you'll have people to discuss this with. You get the SRE on call. We can pull in other people really easily. And that's for me the biggest benefit of it being an incident, right? Is you have a group of people who you can actually talk through options that are available and make a decision.
Right, no, that makes sense.
Do we have DBREs on call? Because I know we have database maintainers, but they are not, well, they are normally like pull out on incident calls. But I wonder if, I think we have DBREs, right? Is it worth it to call them?
Actually, I think it was a Monday, Tuesday or something. I actually needed one. I don't remember exactly. It was again some migration issue, and I think Jarv mentioned like, "Hey, the DBRE should take a look at that." And I went through the handbook and Slack, and I could not find the place where these people are or what they are called. So when I searched for DBRE in Slack, for example, I couldn't find any channel. I think in the handbook, I couldn't really find any clear page that said, "Hey, here's the spreadsheet or whatever it is." And so I ended up going to just the database channel and dumped the message in there. And I think Andreas at some point jumped in, but I think he largely jumped in because he's very, like he keeps eyes on things. He's sort of very out there. If he, for example, wasn't there for the day, I suspect it would have taken hours for somebody to jump in.
I think, again, I think we probably should reframe this a little bit. So like, I think we shouldn't necessarily try and diagnose, like step one, I don't think should necessarily be try and work out like we need this person. I think step one is to go, oh, something's happened. So right. I would think that for that situation, it's an incident. I think almost all the situations are an incident. It's just getting the right severity.
Yeah, I think in this case, there may have been an incident issue already. I don't remember what day it is. There's too much happening during a week. But it's basically like, we have the info, we have the incident, whatever. We need somebody to look at this. Shit, where do we go?
Yeah. And I think that's kind of the point of being on the incident call, right? Like, I think we've got a lot more people. We've got a lot more like KPIs as part of those things, right? Like about site availability, mean time to production, all of that stuff. And once it's officially an incident and we have a group of people, we're on a Zoom call, it's much easier to pull people into that group with us rather than, what I don't like really is if we have to go off and first of all work out like, oh, who do we need? Takes time, relies on you having years of experience in the company, doesn't really scale. And then we put a message in Slack and we're really at the mercy of like when people choose to respond, like, they're deep in their own work. They don't realize there's any priority associated with this. So that's the kind of point of it being an incident.
Right. I think the sort of point for me more there is like, even when we have an incident, at times the people involved, the managers, etc., they may not know who to actually contact. And of course, that's always difficult. But I wonder if there's. That comes back like, if you can't solve it, you revert, which we can't really do. I think kind of in my head, what I kind of want to prevent is having an incident, having a lot of people look at it, figure out, so what's the problem, then everybody going like, okay, shit, now what?
But as a group, we can work it out, right? And the point is it escalates up until we get to the right place, right? So, and that's the real benefit of if after a little while we're like, oh, I don't know, definitely get in the Zoom call, because then you can have a conversation like, what are we missing? Who else do we bring in? But I think it will quite quickly be at a level where we can pull people in.
All right.
So I definitely, in fact, I've updated the release manager docs already. So anything blocking a deployment is an incident.
Right.
I think I do understand what Jorik is trying to say, because when we are an incident, when something is blocking a deployment and we know that we are an incident, normally the SREs on call jumped, the release manager jump into the call. And if something is wrong with the deployment, an application error or something, we bring the dev on call. So we know exactly who to ping. Sometimes this person is not available for whatever reason. Sometimes it is. But when it comes to database migrations or post-migrations problems, devs on calls, they know like what to do sometimes in general scenarios, but we don't have like a database person on call, so to speak, to call and say like, hey, do you know what's going on with this? And sometimes database maintainers or Andreas jump into the call because they are available and they like to keep an eye on things. But it is not like their obligation, so to speak, because well, they can do a lot of other things, like they can be working or whatever, and we don't have, like, if there is no one available because of a coincidence, we are going to be blocked for some hours until someone responds. And that is not particularly of this incident. That has been happening for a lot now. So I think it might be important to highlight that we might need that database on call process.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I definitely hope that within like a kind of, once we have an incident, because those things have really key metrics around them, we have a little bit more leverage. But sure, I'll take an action also to follow up on that one and see like what we can do to try and reduce the risk of that being a thing.
All right, so we'll update those docs. To refresh my memory, was that the, because we're in this little sort of confusing state where I think some of the release management docs is or was moved to the handbook, and then we still have to release docs repo. Do we, let me quickly check if this is something we could put in. So we have this doc called Release Manager MD for the monthly process, but it's not really for that. Let me see if there's a better place, if it's process MD. Monthly use as a diagram, process, deployment. Yeah, it's kind of the question, where would we add this? Because for example, process MD is just a very high level overview of slightly outdated release information.
What's the document that you're using when you're going through a release? What are you following?
So primarily release tasks. I used to use Release Manager MD for checking out the incident and change issues, but we now use JetOps for that, so don't really need that anymore. I actually don't like actively use the docs where like, oh, we have this incident. It's mostly from memory, basically.
Okay. I need to drop off, but do you want to
Sure.
have a look around and see, like, maybe come up with a suggestion of where it might go?
Right.
I mean, maybe just stick an MR against the most appropriate looking one, and we go from there.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. All right. Thanks
All
very
right.
much.
All right. See ya.
Bye.